There are stories that sound too strange, born from places where the cold seems to carve men out of rock, patient, where every breath leaves a trace of vapor that vanishes like time itself. Up here in Alaska, truth and madness often walk the trail, and what one man calls crazy, another calls survival. The story I'm about to tell begins with an old fisherman who lived alone near the edge of frozen bay, where the mountains rise like walls and the sea breathes in long, heavy sighs beneath the ice. His name wasn't famous, his cabin wasn't much, and his life had no audience except the wind that never stopped. Yet somehow, through a mix of stubbornness, instinct, and a strange kind of genius, he managed to melt the snow off his roof with nothing but air, a bit of imagination. He didn't plan to invent anything. In truth, he just wanted to stop the weight of the snow from collapsing his home. The winters here can bury a man's world without warning. 1 week of storms, and your roof carries the weight of 1,000 small, white shovels of silence. Every year, he climbed up there with a broom tied to a long pole, trying to clear it before it got too heavy. But age makes the body slow, and the cold makes the bones forget their strength. So one night, as he listened to the wind moaning through the cracks of his cabin, he began to wonder if that same wind could be turned into use. The thought came like a whisper from the dark, the kind that visits only men who live long enough in solitude to hear the language. The fisherman had no education beyond what the sea had taught him. He knew how to tie knots that never slipped, how to read the cloud, and how to tell when a storm was pretending to pass but was really waiting behind the ridge to strike again. He was a man who trusted the sound of things more than their appearance. So when he heard the whistling of air through the broken boards near his stove, he thought of warmth, not as fire, as movement. That's how the idea began, not with plans or tools, but with a listening heart. He started experimenting the next morning. The sun was weak, low on the horizon, spilling light like liquid honey over the white land. He gathered a few old aluminum pipes he had used to vent smoke from his smoker shack, patched the tape, and angled them to the wind. He didn't know exactly what he was building. He just followed a hunch that if he could trap the wind and guide it, maybe he could create a current of air strong enough to push the snow off the roof. Or better yet, a current that might generate a faint heat through friction or movement. He didn't think of it in scientific terms. He simply said to himself, if the wind's got the strength to tear roofs off, it must have enough to keep mine clear. The neighbors, few as they were, called it his crazy wind duct. They laughed when they saw him climbing onto his roof with a tangle of pipes and ropes, looking like some lost inventor from another century. But up here, madness and necessity often wear the same face. The man didn't argue, didn't explain. He just kept at it, cutting small holes, fitting pieces together, and adjusting angles until the whole contraption looked like a metallic spine crawling up the roof of his cabin. He tied it down, sealed the edges, and waited. That night, the wind came hard from the north, howling through the valley like an old animal that had lost its way. The fisherman sat by his stove, listening to the moan of air through the ducts he'd built. It made a deep, pulsing sound, almost like breathing. Then, sometime before dawn, he noticed something strange. The roof was dripping. He stepped outside, and to his astonishment, the snow above the vented section had begun to melt. Not all of it, but enough to reveal patches of dark, wet wood in the moonlight. The rest of the roof still lay heavy under white silence. Section was alive, steaming faintly against the cold. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. Instead, he stood out, freezing dark, hands buried his coat, watching. He couldn't explain it fully, though he tried later. The fast-moving wind, trapped, redirected through the metal, created friction and compression as it escaped through narrow slits he had carved. The air, forced to move and spin, warmed just enough to lift the edge of the snowpack. It wasn't hot by human measure, but in that frozen world, even a few degrees of warmth could change the fate of a roof. By morning, the snow had sloughed off one entire side. The man stood there smiling, not with pride, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had listened to nature and answered it in its own tongue. His cabin stood lighter, freer, and he felt the same. What he had done wasn't about saving effort or proving something clever. It was about understanding the rhythm of things, how the wind that punishes can also protect, how the same force that freezes you can also save you if you learn to use it. In towns far from the mountains, people talk about innovation as if it's a race to invent something new. But up here, invention is born from stillness, from paying attention. This man's crazy duct wasn't a machine. It was a conversation between a man and the elements, a humble act of cooperation. When word spread, because in Alaska, even the loneliest stories find a way to travel. Some thought it was magic, others thought it was luck. But the truth is, it was just a man who had been alone long enough to hear how wind sounds when it wants to be useful. He kept refining it through the winter, added more ducts, adjusted their length, redirected them toward areas where snow built up the most. Each change taught him something new. He realized that the air's movement wasn't just clearing the roof. It was creating a subtle warmth inside the cabin, too. The draft that once chilled him was now part of a system that circulated air in a gentle loop, keeping the moisture low, the logs dry. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make his home feel alive, like a living organism breathing with the mountain's wind. And there was something else, something harder to explain. The man said later, though only to a friend who visited once every few months, that he could feel a difference in the silence at first night. The mountain, he said, seemed to hum in harmony with his roof, as if by using the wind he had joined a larger rhythm, one that had been playing forever, but that he'd only just learned to hear. He spoke softly about it, not with wonder, but with gratitude. For men like him, miracles weren't loud. They came quietly, disguised as practicality. When people ask about survival in such a place, they expect stories of brute strength or luck, of big fish, bad storm. But the truth of living alone in Alaska is made up of smaller victories, the kind that go unseen, that exist in the spaces between days. It's not about conquering nature, but about finding your place within it, learning its moods. The fisherman's wind duct is just one example, a simple proof. When you stop fighting the elements and start listening, you sometimes listen back. Sometimes, late in the evenings, when the snow started falling again and the world grew quiet, the man would sit by his small window and watch the wind trace patterns through the drifts. He didn't feel pride for what he'd done. He felt peace, because he knew that his little cabin would stand lighter through the storm. The roof would breathe, that he wouldn't have to climb up there anymore to fight what he could now befriend. He would smile, sip from his tin cup, and think of how strange it was that people called his idea crazy. Maybe they were right. But sometimes in this life, a touch of madness is just another name for wisdom. And as I tell you this story, I can't help but wonder where you are. You listen. Maybe you're sitting somewhere warm, far from snow and wind, or maybe you know the sound of cracking beneath your boots. Either way, I'd like to tell me where you're watching from, because every place has its own kind of wind, and maybe, just maybe, there's something in your world waiting to be turned into warmth too. He hadn't always been alone, though looking at him now you'd think solitude was the only life he'd ever known. There was a time when the fisherman's hands smelled not of pine smoke and salt, but of engine oil, fish guts, and the soft perfume of a woman who once waited for him on the porch of a small wooden house by the harbor. Back then, his laughter carried across the docks like a gull's cry, sharp and full of life. He was younger, louder, and like most men who work the sea, he thought he could bargain with time. The years had given him a strong back, stubborn mind, but they'd taken things too. Small things first, like the patience to argue, then larger ones, like the people he loved. His wife had grown tired of the endless waiting, of nights when the storm rolled in, and she'd light a lantern by the window, unsure if he ever returned. She was a gentlewoman, not made for fear, and though she loved him, she could not live in constant uncertainty. The sea had claimed too much of him. She used to say that his eyes always looked past her, toward the horizon, as if something out there was calling him. When she finally left, she didn't do it out of anger, but exhaustion, the quiet kind that no apology can mend. He tried to go on as before, throwing his nets, fixing his boat, pretending the silence in his house was just another form of... But the truth is, he began to feel hollow. The laughter on the docks grated on him. The sound of other men talking about their families filled him with something sharp and unnameable. So one autumn, after his last good season, he sold the boat, gave away what little he had left, and drove until the road ended and the wilderness began. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because he didn't know himself. All he knew was the noise of the world no longer fit inside. He found the cabin by accident. It was half collapsed, an old trapper's place hidden among spruce and alder, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Most people would have turned back, but he saw something in it, a chance to start over, not as a man running away, as one returning to something simpler. The mountain doesn't judge you for what you've lost. It only asks if you're willing. He stayed. The first winter nearly broke him. The storms came early that year, sweeping down from the north with winds that sounded like the growl of something ancient and angry. His firewood ran low, his food spoiled faster than he'd expected, and for weeks he saw no one, not even a passing plane overhead. But in that isolation, something inside him began to shift. He stopped counting days. He stopped thinking of what he'd left behind. The mountain stripped away the noise until only the essentials remained: breath, hunger, movement, and silence. Silence can be a hard teacher. At first, it feels like an enemy pressing against you until you think you'll go mad from the absence of sound. But after a while, it becomes a mirror. It reflects everything you've been avoiding, every thought you buried under words. He learned to listen to it. That was when he started to understand that solitude isn't loneliness. It's the space where truth has room to speak. People often ask why someone would choose to live that way, cut off from everything. They imagine some deep wound, some tragedy so large that the man could no longer bear the company of others. But for him, it wasn't it was return. He wasn't running from people. He was running toward peace. The kind you can't find when you're surrounded by voices that want you to be someone you're not. He spent his first years learning the language of the land. Every crack of ice, every shift of wind became a kind of word. He learned how to read animal tracks, how to tell the difference between the cry of a fox and the echo of a raven. He built traps, repaired the cabin, and over time it became his body, its walls, his ribs, its hearth, his heart. He stopped looking for comfort in memory and found it instead in the rhythm of his day. Morning light through the frosted window, the soft creak of wood as the fire caught, the hiss of boiling water over a small stove. Sometimes, on nights when the aurora painted the sky, he'd sit outside and think about her, the woman who had once waited for him, not with regret, but with a kind of tenderness. At time, he understood then that love, snow, can bury you or keep you warm, depending on Carrie. She had been part of his journey, and though she was gone, the echo of her kindness still lived in him. He realized that leaving wasn't a betrayal, but a continuation. The sea had shaped him, but the mountain was teaching him to listen. The fisherman once said that in the city, he felt like he was drowning even on land. Too many things demanded his attention. Voices, machines, deadlines. Out here, everything was simple. If you didn't chop wood, you were cold. If you didn't catch food, you were hungry. There was no one to blame, no excuses. That kind of clarity scared most people, but for him, It was liberation. He no longer needed to be anyone's idea of success. He only needed to be alive. There's a kind of humility that comes from facing nature every day. The mountain doesn't care about your plans. The snow doesn't pity you. The wind doesn't stop to ask if you're ready. In the beginning, he fought against it, cursing the cold, the endless chores, the isolation. But one morning, after a particularly brutal storm, he stepped outside and saw the sunrise spill across the valley, lighting the frozen trees in gold. Everything glittered. It was so quiet he could hear the ticking of ice crystals as they expanded the sun. That was the moment, he said, when he stopped resisting. He realized that peace isn't found by conquering the wild, but by surrendering to it. Years passed, and the fisherman aged like the mountain, slowly, almost imperceptibly. His beard grew white, his hands rougher, but his movements remained steady. He no longer marked seasons by dates, but by sensation. The way the river smelled in spring, the taste of the air before snow, the color of the sky when the wind shifted east. He didn't need a calendar. Time had become circular, like the rhythm of his breath. He never called himself a hermit or an exile. He just said he'd found a place that matched the shape of his soul. And maybe that's what isolation really is, the moment when your inner silence finally matches the silence outside. For some, it's unbearable. For others, it's home. And if anyone ever asked him whether he missed the world he'd left behind, he would simply smile and say, "The world is right here. It just looks different. You stop trying to own it." That was the heart of the man who built a wind duct out of scrap metal and instinct. His invention wasn't a product of loneliness or boredom. It was born from a lifetime of listening to the sea, to the storms, to his own silence. All those years had prepared him for the moment when he could look at the wind and say, "You and I are not enemies." Some nights he would think of the younger version of himself, the one who shouted over engines and waves, who thought survival meant defying the element. He didn't pity that man. He thanked him. Without those years, he wouldn't have found peace. The past wasn't something to escape, but something to understand. Each mistake, each loss, had been a step toward the stillness he now lived. Out here, far from anyone's expectations, he rediscovered a truth older than civilization itself, that a man doesn't need much to live well, a roof that doesn't leak, a fire that stays lit, food to share with the occasional wanderer who passes by. Everything else is noise. Sometimes he'd say to himself, half aloud, maybe we were never meant to live so fast. He'd seen what hurry does to how it blinds them to the beauty right in front of them. The mountain taught him patience, the kind that can't be learned from books or sermons. It's the patience of snow melting grain by grain, of rivers carving valleys one drop at a time. He found joy in small things, the crackle of firewood, the glint of sunlight on ice, the soft flutter of wings when a ptarmigan landed near his window. Each of these moments was a reminder that life, stripped of all excess, still had music in it. And so the fisherman became part of the mountain story, and the mountain became part of his. Together, they lived in a quiet understanding, one man, one place, breathing in rhythm. If you've ever felt the need to step away from the noise, to hear your own thoughts again, maybe you understand him more than you think. Sometimes what looks like isolation is just a different kind of belonging. And if this story speaks to you, if you can feel even a trace of that longing for stillness, I invite you to stay close, to listen, to follow, to join this quiet path with me. There's more to tell, more to learn from this man and his mountain. So take a moment now, if you wish, to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the story of his solitude is just beginning, and the lesson it holds might just be the one you've been waiting to hear. Life in silence is not what most people imagine. It isn't an absence of sound or a void of experience. It's something fuller, thicker, like a deep current that moves beneath the visible surface of things. For the fisherman, silence became a companion, a kind of invisible creature that followed him everywhere. In the beginning, it made him uneasy. He used to fill it with the noise of his own work, the scraping of the knife against fish skin, the chopping of wood, the clatter of tin cups on the table. But as time passed, he began to realize silence was not empty at all. It was alive with whispers, wind through trees, snow settling on the roof, the faint drip of melting ice. It was the mountain speaking in its slow, deliberate way, and all he had to do was listen. The days unfolded in a rhythm that felt both ancient and natural. He would rise before dawn, not because of habit, but because his body had learned the light. When the sky began to pale, he could feel it even with his eyes closed, the temperature shifting, the stillness before the wind returned. He would stoke the fire, boil water, and step outside to breathe in the cold. The air in those early hours was so pure, it burned the lungs slightly, and in that small discomfort, there was a kind of pleasure. Every breath reminded him that he was alive, that he was part of something much larger and older than himself. He had no need for clocks, calendars. The mountain marked time for him, the shape of the sun on the ridge, the length of the shadows on his cabin floor, the way the snow changed texture underfoot. All of it told him what he needed to know. In summer, the air was sharp and bright, filled with the smell of pine and salt from the far-off sea. In winter, the world closed in, muffled by snow so thick that sound itself seemed to sink into it. He came to love that quiet heaviness, that still, slow pulse of life hiding beneath the ice. He learned to live with the animals, too. There was a fox that visited sometimes, slinking near the wood-polished amber. The man never tried to tame it, but he always left scraps at the door, and after a while the fox stopped running away when it saw him. Once he watched it sit on the snow and lift its face toward the wind, as if listening to something far away. In that moment, he felt they were not so different, the man and the animal, both shaped by hunger, both living in the rhythm of weather and waiting. He grew his food when the ground allowed, tended to small patches of green sprouted behind the cabin in the brief, generous summer. Potatoes, a few herbs, and hardy vegetables that could survive the chill. The soil here was stingy but honest. It gave only what you were willing to work for. When he harvested, he did so slowly, speaking to the plants under his breath as if thanking them for their patience. It may sound strange, but when you live alone long enough, you start to talk to everything. The fire, the tools, the wind, even the stones, not out of madness, but out of recognition. You begin to understand that everything is alive in its own way. Evenings, the human mind, at first, no matter how calm, has a way of reaching backward when the light fades. Memories grow stronger in darkness. He would sit by the stove, watching the flames move, and the faces of his past would appear in them. The woman he'd lost, the friends who'd gone, the sea that had nearly killed him more than once. But instead of pushing the memories away, he began to let them stay. They would visit like old ghosts, sit with him a while, and then fade back into the silence. That was his way of making peace. He read when the light allowed it. The books he had were old and few, one about navigation, of poetry, and a Bible that had belonged to his father. But more often than not, he preferred to read the sky. The clouds were his text, the stars his punctuation. He could tell by the twilight when the temperature would drop, by the flight of birds when a storm was coming. It was a kind of literacy that no school could teach. Sometimes, when the days were long and the air still, he would walk to the edge of the frozen bay. There, he could hear the ice groan, a low, deep sound that traveled through the ground and into his bones. It reminded him that nothing in nature is truly still. Even in silence, everything is moving, changing, breathing. He began to sense that the same was true inside him. The man who had come to the mountain to escape had slowly dissolved into something else. He no longer thought of himself as separate from the land. He was part of it, and it was part of him. He made small rituals of daily life. Every morning, he would open the door and greet the day aloud, no matter the weather. Every evening, he would thank the fire before letting it die. These gestures were not superstition, but gratitude. He understood every comfort here was borrowed from the trees that gave their wood, from the fish that gave their life, from the air filled his lungs. Gratitude became his prayer, and silence his church. The nights were vast, endless. Sometimes, when the moon rose full and the snow glittered like silver dust, he would walk far from the cabin just to feel the scale of it all. The stars above him seemed close enough to touch, the world below him so small that he could almost hear it turning. In those moments, he felt fear, no loneliness, only wonder. He realized that solitude was not emptiness, but abundance, a fullness of presence that modern life had forgotten. He came to understand that peace isn't the absence of trouble, the art of moving gently through it. When storms came, he didn't curse them anymore. He'd sit by the fire, listening to the wind slam against the wall, smile. The mountain, he knew, was just reminding him that nothing lasts forever, not peace. There's beauty in truth, he often said, because if peace were permanent, we would forget to value it. Over the years, his senses sharpened. He could smell snow before it fell. He could tell by the sound of a raven's call whether it was warning or play. He could sense when the ice on the bay was about to shift, long before the cracks appeared. Living in silence had tuned him to the frequency of the. He became a listener not just of sounds, meaning. Sometimes wanderers would find their way to his cabin, hunters, lost hikers, or travelers chasing stories. They always came curious, expecting to find a man half wild or broken by solitude. Instead, they found someone calm, gentle, and deeply attentive. He would offer them tea, share food, and listen to their tales without judgment. They often left changed, though they couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was because being near someone who has made peace with silence forces you to confront your own noise. He never sought to teach, but his way of living became its own lesson. People began to speak of him as a legend, the old fisherman in the mountains who melted snow with wind and lived in harmony with the world. He never thought of himself that. To him, he was just a man who had stopped running. What few understood is that silence is not the absence of connection. In fact, it deepens it. The fisherman felt closer to everything, the trees, the animals, the very air, because there was nothing left in him that resisted their presence. The walls between self and world had thinned until they were almost transparent. He no longer looked for meaning in words or action. Meaning, he discovered, was already everywhere, waiting to be noticed. And so the days turned into years, and the man grew older. His hair silvered, his movements slowed, but his eyes remained bright. He no longer needed much to be happy. A warm fire, a working roof, the sound of wind moving through the ducts that had once been called crazy. Those ducts still whispered every night, carrying the breath of the mountain through his home. It was as if the world itself was keeping him company. When people from the nearby village asked him if he ever planned to return, he would smile and shake his head. "There's nowhere to return to," he'd say. "This is the only place I've ever really arrived." And perhaps that's what silence does. It doesn't take you away from the world. It brings you closer to its center. It strips away the unnecessary until only truth remains. The fisherman, who once lived among storms and noise, had found that truth not in words, but in listening. He lived that way for many winters, content, unseen, part of a story that belonged as much to the mountain as to him. The challenge came one winter unlike any other, the kind that tests even the most patient soul. It began early, long before the lakes had sealed themselves with ice, with a strange heaviness in the air that warned of a season that would not be kind. The old fisherman felt it before he saw it. The wind carried a different sound. The birds moved south sooner, and the light had a pale, uncertain hue that made the world look older than it was. He'd lived through dozens of winters, each with its own rhythm and temper, but this one felt different, almost deliberate, as if the mountain itself were preparing to speak. By mid-November, the storms began. They didn't arrive in gusts, bursts like usual, but came steady and relentless day after day, coating the valley in layer upon layer of white until the world itself seemed swallowed by it. His small cabin groaned under the wind ducks that had served him faithfully for years, whistled, howled with unfamiliar fury. He would wake at night, the sound of snow off the roof, only to hear new drifts forming again by morning. Every movement outside became a test. The cold was not merely cold. It was alive, sharp, and watchful, like a creature studying his endurance. At first, he faced it calmly. He chopped extra firewood, sealed the cracks in the walls, and stored more food than what he'd need. But as the days turned to weeks, without a break in the weather, he began to feel the strain of isolation pressing harder than usual. The silence that had once comforted him now grew dense, almost oppressive. Even the fox stopped visiting. The trees stood frozen and still, their branches heavy with ice, their usual murmurs stilled to nothing. The world had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if even sound itself had frozen. Then came the morning when he woke to find the wind ducks blocked. Ice had built up along their mouths, sealing them like clogged arteries. Without the air flowing freely, the system he'd built years ago had turned dormant, and snow began to pile again on the roof, heavier than ever before. He climbed up carefully, cold biting through his gloves, his breath crystallizing before his face. The sky was colorless, a dull white that gave no sense of direction. He tried to chip away the ice with a chisel, but each blow sent a tremor through the metal, threatening to crack it. The ducks had become brittle with frost. He paused then, sitting on the roof in the middle of that endless whiteness, listening. It was there that he realized something profound. His invention, the very thing that had made his life easier, had also made him less attentive. For years, he had trusted the wind to do his work, but in doing so, he had stopped listening as closely as before. He had let routine replace awareness. The mountain was reminding him, as it always did, that comfort is the first step toward forgetfulness. So he decided to rebuild it, not repair, but reimagine. Not out of frustration, but curiosity. He took apart the ducks one by one, laying them out in the snow like the bones of some old creature. He studied them as if they were a message written in metal, trying to understand what the wind had been trying to tell him. The process took days. He worked slowly, hands stiff and numb, stopping often to warm them by the fire before going out again. During that time, something strange began to happen. He noticed that when the wind hit certain hollows in the valley, it made a low hum, a resonant vibration that echoed faintly against the cabin walls. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the kind of tricks solitude plays. But as he listened closer, he realized it was real. The mountain itself was singing. It wasn't music in the way people know it. It was deeper, a vibration that passed through the ground and through him. The more he listened, the more he could feel it guiding his hands, suggesting new shapes and angles. He built new ducks from what he had, pieces of old aluminum, hollow bamboo he'd used for fishing poles, even sections of driftwood he'd collected over the years. He arranged them not just for function, but for harmony, aligning them with the natural contours of the wind. It wasn't science, at least not in any formal sense. It was intuition, guided by the same instinct that had led him to the mountain in the first place. When he finally finished, the contraption looked like something alive, a twisting, interwoven structure of wood and metal that caught the light in strange ways. It rose from the roof like a spiral, open, whispering softly, the breeze through it. He had no idea if it would work, but that didn't matter. It wasn't about melting snow anymore. It was about listening, about answering something that had called to him from the heart of storm. That night, the wind came back stronger than before. It roared through the valley, tearing at the trees, slamming against the cabin. The fisherman sat by the fire, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable sound of collapse. But instead, he heard something else, a deep, resonant hum that grew louder as the storm intensified. The ducks were vibrating, singing back to the mountain the same tone he'd heard days earlier. The sound filled the cabin, not as noise, as warmth. It wasn't heat that melted the snow this time. It was vibration, energy created by the dance between air and structure. By morning, the storm had passed, and the roof was clear. The new system had worked, but more than that, it had revealed something hidden. The air inside the cabin felt charged, alive. He stepped outside and saw that the snow around his home had melted in a perfect circle, as if marked by an invisible boundary. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was communion. The mountain had accepted his offering. He spent the next days in quiet reflection. It wasn't lost on him that what others had once called crazy had again become his salvation. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't invention that mattered. It was relation. He hadn't forced nature to obey him. He'd joined it. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to collaborate with the world instead of trying to conquer it. When the thaw finally came and the rivers began to break open, he walked along their edges, listening to the sound of the ice giving way. It was the same sound he'd heard in the Duct, the same hum of change. He realized then that everything, the wind, snow, the mountain, even himself, was part of one continuous motion. Nothing in nature stood still. Everything was transforming, including him. He laughed aloud that day, the sound echoing through the valley. It wasn't joy exactly, but something deeper, a release. The weight of years, of solitude, of unspoken question lifted. He'd found what he hadn't even known he was looking for: connection without dependence, peace without control. The mountain had given him that, not through comfort, but through challenge. From that winter on, he became even quieter, not withdrawn, but settled, like water finding its level. He no longer needed to speak of what he'd built or what he'd survived. He had learned that some things lose their truth and spoken aloud. The real discoveries, the ones that matter, live silent inside you. When travelers came and asked about the strange structure on his roof, he would smile and say, "It's not mine. It's the mountain's breath." And they would laugh, thinking it was just a poetic answer. But he meant it. He had merely given shape to what was already there. Sometimes, at dusk, when the air turned gold and the wind began to stir, he would sit outside and listen to the ducks sing. Each note was different, depending on the direction of the breeze and the temperature of the air. It was as if the world were playing an instrument built from its own body. He would close his eyes, feeling the vibration through his skin, and think of how far he had come, from the noise of the docks to the silence of the mountain, from chasing storms to becoming part of. And if there was a lesson in it all, it was this: what we call challenges are often invitations in disguise. The mountain had tested him not to break him, but to bring him closer to understanding. Discovery, he realized, is not about finding something new. It's about seeing what's always been there, waiting for you to be quiet enough to notice. He lived that truth with every breath. Every gust of wind that passed through his cabin was a reminder that nature doesn't need to be fought or feared. It needs to be heard. And maybe, if you've ever faced a storm in your own life, you know what he felt that winter, the moment when everything seems ready to collapse, but something inside you listens instead of panicking. That's where discovery lives, not in triumph, but in surrender. So if this story finds you now, wherever you are, remember the fisherman and his wind duct. the man who turned cold air into warmth by learning to listen. And if you haven't yet, take a moment to stay close, to follow this path of silence and wonder. Subscribe so you can walk with him further, because the next part of his journey, his reflection on the world and on what it means to be human, is where the deepest truths begin to unfold. With the passing years, reflection became the fisherman's greatest companion. Not the kind of reflection born of regret, but the slow, patient understanding that grows in men who have lived long enough to stop fighting the world. The mountain had taught him that wisdom isn't gathered from books or words, but from the way one observes small things, the melting snow, the rhythm of wind, the silence fills spaces between. He began to think not just about his own strange nature of humanity. He often wondered why men in cities, with all their machines and comforts, still seemed so hungry. They had everything the world could offer: warmth, light, company, yet their hearts were restless, always reaching for something more. He'd seen it in himself once, that endless pursuit of purpose, that need to prove worth through work, through possession, through noise. Here, in the vast stillness of the mountain, he saw it for what it truly was: fear, not fear of death, but fear of silence, because silence reveals truth, and truth is not always kind. He would sit for hours outside his cabin, pipe in hand, watching the clouds move. Each one was a lesson. They drifted freely, unbothered by shape or direction, carried by whatever wind came. People, he thought, could learn from clouds. They spend their lives trying to control the current, to fight against what is natural, only to exhaust themselves. The mountain had no ambition, yet it endured. The trees had no plan, yet even the snow grew, which seemed lifeless, moved in harmony with the world. It fell, melted, became water, and returned again as snow. Life, he realized, is not a straight line. It's a cycle, a slow return to balance. Sometimes he would think of the fishermen he'd once known, their laughter, their argument, their endless talk of weather, luck, and profit. He remembered they measured seasons, how every day was judged gain. He used to live like that too, his worth defined by what he could bring home. But here, in the quiet, he learned a different measure of value. A good day was not one filled with success or accomplishment, but one filled with presence. A day when he noticed the light on the snow, the flight of a bird, the taste of clean air. These were his riches now, invisible to most, but priceless to him. He reflected on the world's rush, on the constant race that people seemed trapped in. They spoke of freedom, yet chained themselves to the idea of progress, never questioning what they were progressing toward. He had no anger toward them, only sadness. He knew that most people never have the chance to stop long enough to see how deeply lost they live, surrounded by noise, because silence demands honesty, and honest is heavier than most can bear. Out here, stripped of distraction, he saw the world's patterns clearly. He saw how man, in trying to dominate nature, had forgotten he was part of it. He saw how people filled their homes with things but emptied their hearts of meaning. He saw how technology gave them voices that could reach across continents, yet few could speak to themselves with kindness. He wondered if the great noise of modern life was just a way to drown out the sound of their own souls calling to them. And yet, he did not judge. Judgment is another form of noise. He understood that each person carries their own mountain inside them, a weight, a silence, a truth they either face or flee. He had simply chosen to face his. That was the difference. One day, as he repaired a section of his roof, he found himself thinking about time. The boards beneath his hands were the same ones he'd placed years ago, but they had aged, cracked, changed. He realized that everything he built would one day disappear, swallowed by weather and time. Even the wind ducts, his proud invention, would someday crumble into rust and dust. But that thought didn't sadden him. It comforted him, because impermanence, he realized, is not loss. It's grace. It means that nothing truly belongs to us, and therefore Nothing can be truly taken away. He began to see beauty in decay, the slow peeling of paint, the way moss grew over stones, the soft collapse of snowdrifts in the sun. Everything that faded did so with dignity. Nothing
He wondered
clung
why
to
humans,
its form. The only creatures who could understand impermanence, feared it so much. The trees didn't mourn their fallen leaves. The river didn't grieve its changing path. Only man resisted the natural order. Only man mistook change for death. In his quiet hour, he thought often about love, not romantic love, but the kind that binds all things together. He realized that love is not possession or longing, but recognition. It's the act of seeing something, truly seeing it, and allowing it to be what it is. The mountain didn't need him, but it accepted him. The wind didn't speak his language, but it taught him to listen. The snow didn't show mercy, yet it gave him lessons in endurance. That, he decided, was love in its purest form, existence without demand. Sometimes he would speak aloud to the air, not out of madness, gratitude. "Thank you," he would whisper to the mountain, to the trees, to the invisible forces that shaped his days. Gratitude became his prayer, the only religion he needed. He no longer asked for anything. Asking, he'd learned, implies lack. Gratitude, on the other hand, affirms abundance. Even on the hardest days, he had what he needed: breath, warmth, awareness. What more could a man ask for? He often wondered what the world might look like if people rediscovered stillness, if they turned off their engines, their screens, their endless talking, and just sat with themselves for a while. Would they be afraid of what they found? Or would they finally hear the hum of life beneath the noise? Maybe they'd discover that peace isn't hiding in some faraway place, right there, beneath their own breath. The fisherman's reflections deepened over the years, but he never became bitter or detached. Solitude had not hardened, it had softened him. He moved slower, spoke gentler, and laughed more easily. He found humor in small things: a stubborn log that wouldn't split, a bird that scolded him from a branch. He saw how fragile and beautiful life was, how easily it could vanish, and that made him love it more fiercely. When wanderers came to visit, he welcomed them as he always did. Some stayed for hours, others for days. They often came full of questions about survival, about how he managed to live so far from civilization. But by the time they left, their question had changed. They no longer asked how he survived, but why they didn't live as simply. He never told them what to do. He only told them what he'd learned, that peace is not a destination, but a practice, and that the world outside mirrors the one within. He told them that loneliness is just a misunderstanding. We are never truly alone, he said, not when the world is alive in every breath, every gust of wind, every ripple of water. Loneliness is what happens when we stop seeing ourselves as part of that living whole. Connection isn't built through words or proximity. It's felt through presence. If you are present, you belong everywhere. At night, he would lie in his bed, listening to the soft hum of the ducks, and think about humanity's great paradox, that the more people have, the less they seem to feel. The mountain had given him little, yet he felt rich beyond measure. He had no electricity, no noise, no crowd, but he had something the world seemed to have forgotten: contentment, not joy, not excitement, quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from living rightly, with respect for what is. He realized, too, that his life was not an escape from the world, but a reflection of it. The mountain, in all its silence, mirrored the same patterns found in people's hearts: the storms, the thaws, the renewals. To live here was to live inside a metaphor for existence itself. And once he saw that, he stopped thinking of himself as separate from humanity. He was still part of it, just observing it from a clearer vantage. He sometimes wondered if anyone down below the towns and cities ever felt this same sense of harmony. Maybe they did. A fleeting moment of rain on windows, smell of earth storm in the of an early morning before those were the moments, he thought, when the mountain whispered even to those far away. Most just didn't know how to listen anymore. So he lived on, content in his reflection, carrying no bitterness, no pride, just gratitude, quiet, just life, unfolding as it should. And if you followed his story this far, perhaps it has spoken to something inside you too. That quiet place you rarely visit, the one that waits beneath all the noise. Stay with it, listen to it. There's more to learn from this man, from his mountain, and from the silence that shaped them both. So if you haven't yet, stay close, subscribe, and continue walking this path with him. Because the end of his story is not really an ending. It's the moment when everything finally comes full circle. The years passed like the slow drift of snow across the ridge, each season folding gently into the next until time itself became a soft blur. The fisherman grew old, not suddenly but gradually, as the mountain does. His hair turned white as frost, his beard long and tangled like the roots of the spruce that guarded his cabin. The lines on his face deepened, tracing the same quiet pattern the wind carved into the eye. He no longer fought the years. He welcomed them as he did the season, each bringing its own kind of beauty, its own lesson in letting go. The mountain never stopped speaking to him. It spoke through the creak of frozen branches, through the rustle of melting snow, through the low hum of wind in the ducts that had become his companion. Sometimes, when the weather was calm and the air was still, the sound of those ducks seemed almost like a voice, familiar, steady. He liked to think it was the mountain breathing with him, as if to say, "We're still here." He no longer needed to do much. The rhythm of his days had slowed to the pace of nature. He woke when the light touched his eyelid, slept when darkness folded over the valley. He ate little, spoke less, and spent long hours sitting outside his cabin, watching the world move. He could feel his body changing, growing slower, weaker, but inside there was no fear. He had lived enough winters to know that everything that fades gives way to something. The body was just another mountain, slowly eroding into its natural form. In those quiet years, visitors came less often, but sometimes a traveler or a young wanderer would still find their way to his door, drawn by the legend that had grown around him. They came curious, carrying cameras and notebooks, eager to hear about the man who had tamed the wind. He would laugh gently at the idea of taming anything. "You don't tame the wind," he would say. "You listen to it." And then he would pour them tea and sit in silence until they grew comfortable enough to stop asking questions. That was always the moment when the real conversation began, not with words, but with stillness. Many of them left changed, though they couldn't explain why. Some cried without knowing the reason. Others left promising to return, though few ever did. But he didn't need them to. He knew that what they sought wasn't him, but the reflection of something they'd forgotten in themselves. The quiet, the connection, the unspoken truth that life isn't about control, but communion. He was simply a reminder, a mirror, not a teacher. One spring, when the snow began to melt earlier than usual, he noticed a gentle thaw felt. The sound of dripping water came like melody, and the air scent of pine earth. He spent hours sitting by the stream that ran behind his cabin, listening to the flow. It was there he realized something final and simple, that all his years on the mountain had not been about isolation at all. They had been about belonging. He hadn't escaped the world. He had rejoined it, one quiet breath at a time. He began to feel a strange lightness then, as if some invisible weight had lifted. The wind that once bit at his skin now felt like a touch of reassurance. The silence that had once challenged him now felt like home. Every sound, every crack, whisper, and sigh was familiar, intimate. He no longer distinguished between himself and the landscape. When he looked at the snow, he felt its stillness inside him. When he heard the wind, it moved through him as naturally as breath. He had become what he had always admired, part of the mountain's quiet. As the days grew longer, he began to write again. Not much, just a few notes in an old, weather-stained notebook he kept since his fishing days. The writing was small and slow, his hand trembling slightly, but his words were steady. He wrote not for others, but to leave something behind, not as a legacy of knowledge, but as a reminder of listening. He wrote of the wind duct, of the storm, of the silence that had become his friend. He wrote of the way snow teaches patience, of how fire hums like memory, of how even the hardest winters carry mercy if you know how to see it. He wrote that peace is not the absence of noise, but the ability to remain still. That solitude is not loneliness, but the return to one's natural rhythm. That love, in its truest form, is the act of allowing all things to be as they are. One of his last entries was just a single sentence. The wind no longer visits. It lives here. As his strength waned, the fisherman stopped trying to repair or build. He didn't climb the roof anymore or chop large logs for the fire. The mountain provided in smaller ways. The wood he had split in years past was enough. The roof held strong, and the ducks continued to sing softly, carrying the mountain's breath through his home. Even his hunger changed. He ate less, not out of need, but out of balance. His body had become part of the rhythm now, and he trusted it completely. There were nights when he would wake to sound of distant thunder rolling beyond the ridges. He would lie there, eyes open, smiling at the sound. It reminded him of the sea, of the world he'd left long ago. He wondered about her sometime, the woman who had once lived, the friends who had gone on living in their own storm. He didn't regret leaving them, nor did he regret remembering. Everything belonged where it was. Life, he knew now, doesn't divide into choices or mistakes. It just unfolds. One morning, late in the season, when the air was still and the first golden light touched the peaks, he stepped outside, barefoot. The ground was cold, damp from the night frost, but he didn't mind. He looked toward the horizon, sky, the mountain, and for the first time in years, he spoke aloud. "I'm ready," he said to anyone, but to the silence itself. It was not a farewell, not even a prayer. It was an acknowledgment, a quiet acceptance that his circle was complete. No one was there to see when he went. The mountain knew. The wind at morning was gentle, carrying through the ducks with a low, steady hum that filled the cabin with warmth. The fire burned soft. A mug of tea sat half-finished on the table, still steaming faintly. The fisherman had simply fallen asleep in his chair, his hands resting peacefully in his lap, a small smile frozen on his face. The mountain had taken him the way it gives everything, silently, naturally, without ceremony. When the next traveler found the cabin months later, he found everything as it had been, untouched and calm. The notebook lay open on the table, the last page blank. The wind ducks still sang in the breeze, their hum echoing across the valley like a voice too ancient to belong to one man. The traveler stood, listening for a long time, feeling the vibration move through his. It wasn't sorrow he felt, but peace, a sense that the man who had lived there hadn't vanished, but had become part of everything around him. The villagers later said that after his passing, the snow near his cabin never stayed long. Even in the heaviest winters, the roof remained clear, the air above it faintly shimmering in the cold light. Some called it a mist, others a miracle, but those who had met him before understood. It was the wind, still moving through the ducks, still alive with his touch. The mountain had kept his memory in motion, carrying it through the valleys, whispering his name through the trees, and so his story spread, not through books or monuments, but through the quiet retelling of those who had walked near his home and heard the song of the wind. They would say, "That's where the man lived who melted snow with air." But those who listened closely knew it was more than. He hadn't just melted snow. He had melted the boundaries between man and world, between solitude and connection, between silence and sound. His legacy wasn't invention or endurance, but understanding. He had shown that the world doesn't need to be conquered or escaped, only respected. That peace isn't something you find, it's something you allow. That the truest strength is gentleness, and the truest wisdom is listening. And perhaps that is what remains of him now. Not the cabin, not the wind ducks, not even the story, but the silence he left behind. A silence that still hums softly through the pines, reminding anyone who listens that there is beauty in stillness, that life, even at its quietest, is full of music. So if you're hearing this story now, wherever you are, in a warm room, a quiet corner, or beneath your own storm, take a breath and listen. The same wind that moved through his mountain moves through yours. The same silence that held him waits for you too. And if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of what it sounds like, take a moment to share it. Leave a word, a thought, a simple trace of where you're listening from. Subscribe if you wish to carry these stories with you, to remember that somewhere far away, never truly gone, a fisherman once taught the wind to sing, because the mountain is still breathing, and so are we.